All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something that, well, let's be honest. A lot of guys worry about male pattern baldness. Yeah, we're tackling those vanishing locks today, and we've got some really interesting research from PROFUE
It's
Talks.
definitely a topic that needs, a good deep dive.
I was actually surprised by some of the stuff I learned prepping for this. Like, did you know that whole thing about hats causing hair loss is totally a myth?
Oh yeah, that was a classic.
So buckle up. We're going to bust some myths and get into the real science of why that hair might be, well, disappearing.
Sounds good to me. And I think, even though hair loss is totally natural for a lot of guys, the way it can make people feel like less confident or whatever, that's important to talk about too.
For sure. But before we get all emotional, let's start with, like, what actually is male pattern baldness?
Right. The technical term is androgenetic alopecia.
Yeah.
But basically, it's hair loss that happens in like a predictable way.
Okay, so there's a pattern to the madness.
Exactly. You often see that receding hairline, that classic M shape,
Hmm.
or maybe some thinning at the crown.
Gotcha. So it's not like you just wake up one morning and poof, all your hair's gone.
Nope, definitely not. It's gradual, happens over time.
Okay, so it's sneaky, not sudden.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the why is so important.
So what is the why here? Why does it happen
Mhm.
in the first place?
Well, there's this hormone called DHT, dihydrotestosterone.
Okay, got it.
Now, DHT isn't like a bad guy all the time, but some hair follicles are, well, really sensitive to it.
Sensitive how? Like what happens?
Okay, so imagine your hair follicles are these tiny little gardens,
Right.
right? DHT is like this pesky weed that for some guys just starts creeping in,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
and it messes with the whole growth cycle of the hair. It actually shrinks those follicles, smaller and smaller.
Uh-oh. Sounds bad.
Yeah, till they can't, produce hair anymore.
So it's like those little gardens are getting choked out.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got genetics playing a role too.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Right. Genetics kind of sets the stage for how sensitive your follicles are to that DHT in the first place.
So, like, some guys are just predisposed to this whole DHT weed situation.
Yeah. And then as men get older, those hormone levels change,
Yeah.
and that can kickstart that whole thinning and loss process.
Okay, that makes sense. Like a perfect storm of genetics and hormones. But, okay, before we go too deep into the sciencey stuff, I gotta ask about the myths. Like, is there any truth to the whole wearing a hat makes you go bald thing?
That's a myth, a total myth.
Sure, good to know.
Hats don't damage your follicles or anything, so rock that baseball cap with pride.
My beanie collection is rejoicing right now.
And same goes for shampooing. It's just meant to clean your scalp, not cause hair loss.
Okay, so what does actually damage hair follicles then?
Well, things like really tight hairstyles or braids that pull on the hair a lot, but that's a whole other story.
Got it. So hats and shampoo are safe. Phew. Okay, what about the idea that once you start losing hair, like, there's nothing you can do? Game over.
Ah, yeah, that's another one that's been busted by modern science.
Really? So there I is hope.
Totally. That ProFUE podcast we're looking at dives into some pretty amazing techniques, things like sapphire FUE and DHI hair transplantation.
Okay, those sound intense. What exactly are we talking about here?
They're actually like changing people's lives. It's not just about stopping hair loss. It's about restoring what's been lost, bringing it back.
Wow, okay.
So with sapphire FUE, imagine these tiny sapphire blades. They carefully pick up individual hairs.
Hold on. Individual hairs.
Yeah, from the back of your head, usually where hair tends to be thicker, more resistant to that DHT we were talking about.
Makes sense.
And then they very carefully place them into those thinning areas.
So it's like a tiny hair transplant.
Yeah. And because those blades are sapphire, they're super precise. It minimizes damage to the surrounding tissue, which means faster healing and more natural-looking results.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture, so it's very precise.
Exactly. And then there's DHI, direct hair implantation. It's even more precise. They use this special device, kind of like a pen, to implant each follicle one by one.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it gives the surgeons amazing control over like the angle and direction of each hair.
So it's all about getting it just right.
Right. And that makes DHI especially good for creating like really natural looking hairlines.
That's amazing. The fact that this level of precision even exists blows my mind. Now, I noticed that ProFUE seems to be based in Antalya, Turkey. Is there something about Antalya specifically that's made it like a hair restoration hotspot?
That's interesting, right? There are actually a few factors at play. From what I've read, clinics in Antalya can offer these procedures at a significantly lower cost than in a lot of other places.
So cost is definitely a factor.
Definitely. But it's not just about the price tag. Toki, and Antalya in particular, has this reputation for having, really skilled professionals who specialize in hair restoration.
Oh, okay, so they've really invested in this field.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's Antalya itself, which is this gorgeous city on the Mediterranean.
So you could combine like a life-changing procedure with a relaxing recovery in a beautiful place. It almost sounds too good to be true.
It does, right.
Mm.
Like the ultimate self-care retreat. And from what I understand, clinics like PROFUE offer these all-inclusive packages that take care of everything. Consultations, airport transfers, accommodation, even post-operative care.
So they really handle everything. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what causes male pattern baldness, busted some myths, and even explored these cutting-edge solutions like Sapphire FUE and DHI. What stands out to you as like the most important thing for listeners to remember from all this?
That's a good question. I think the key takeaway is that for so long, hair loss felt like something you just had to accept. You know, like there was nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, that's how it used to be.
But with these new advancements, it's no longer about just surrendering to it. It's about taking control, exploring options, and finding what's right for you.
I love that. It's a really empowering way to think about it, and I'm sensing there's even more to uncover here. So stick with us. We'll be right back after a quick break to dive even deeper into the world of hair restoration.
It's funny how these procedures like the Sapphire FUE and the DHI, they really show how important it is to get WHY hair loss happens. Once you know how that DHT is messing with your follicles, you can really start to target the problem.
That's a great point, like know your enemy, right? And speaking of going into battle, what about the recovery process after a hair transplant? What can someone actually expect after one of these procedures?
That's where Antalya's reputation for having those skilled professionals really comes in. They
Right.
don't just do the procedure and send you home. It's not like that. They really emphasize personalized aftercare to make sure you heal properly and get the best results.
Okay, so what does that aftercare actually look like? Is there a lot of downtime, bandages for weeks?
Not at all. Of course, there are specific guidelines to follow. Everyone heals a bit differently. But with how much the technology has advanced, most people can go back to their normal routines within a few days.
So it's not as intense as it sounds.
Nope. And plus, imagine this. You're not just recovering at home. You're in Antalya, enjoying the Mediterranean. It almost sounds like a vacation.
It does, right? Like the ultimate self-care experience. But, whenever I hear about medical tourism, I always wonder about the quality of care. Is it really as good as what you'd get, closer to home?
That's a totally fair concern. To be honest, I was wondering the same thing when I was researching for this episode.
Mm.
But from what I've gathered, these Turkish clinics like PROFUE are really upfront about their commitment to quality. They follow international standards, use the latest technology. They even encourage potential patients to check out reviews and testimonials from people who've had procedures done there.
So transparency is a big part of their approach. I think that's really important for building trust, especially when you're traveling for a medical procedure.
Okay, so we've talked about the science behind hair loss,
Mm.
debunked some myths, explored some of those advanced solutions. We even talked about Antalya and what makes it so unique for hair restoration. Is there anything else we're missing here?
Hmm. We touched on the psychological impact of hair loss, but I think we could dig a little deeper into that. It's one thing to understand what's happening physically, but it's another thing to deal with the emotional side of things.
Right, it's not just about the physical changes.
Exactly. For a lot of guys, hair loss can really affect their confidence, how they see themselves, their relationships, all of that.
I can imagine. It makes sense, right? There are all these ideas about masculinity and attractiveness tied to hair. So losing it could feel like you're losing a part of yourself in a way.
Definitely.
It's got to be tough to deal with.
It is, for sure.
So what advice would you give someone who's struggling with those feelings? Well, first of all, remember that you're not alone. Hair loss is incredibly common, even if it doesn't feel like it when you're going through it.
Mm.
And there are healthy ways to cope,
Like what?
talking to friends and family or even a therapist. Sometimes just acknowledging those feelings out loud can really help.
I like that, just getting it out there.
Yeah, and it goes back to that idea of taking control, right? Not just of the physical hair loss, but of your emotional well-being too.
Finding that sense of agency.
Exactly. And I think that's something ProFU subtly emphasizes as well.
Mm.
It's not just about the technical skill of their team. It's about that personalized approach supporting you through the whole journey.
It's a more holistic approach, treating the whole person.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the science, the solutions, the location. And the emotional piece.
Yeah.
Anything else we should add to this mix?
Well, we've talked about all the amazing stuff happening in hair restoration right now,
Mm.
but I think it's exciting to think about the future, too. There's so much research going on that could totally revolutionize this field.
Really? Like what's on the horizon?
Well, one thing researchers are really focused on is developing new medications and therapies, ones that actually target the root cause of hair loss.
So instead of just treating the symptoms, you're preventing it altogether.
Exactly. Imagine something that could stop those follicles from shrinking in the first place.
Wow. That would be a game changer.
Right. And there's a lot of buzz around stem cell research and gene editing, too.
Okay, now we're getting into sci-fi territory.
Oh, no, right. It's still early stages, but the potential is huge.
It is. So for someone listening who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this info, the science, the solutions, the future possibilities, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I'd say take a deep breath and remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about hair loss, the better decisions you can make for yourself. If you're noticing some thinning or you've been dealing with hair loss for a while, don't give up hope. There are options out there, and with all these advancements, the future looks pretty bright.
I love that. A message of hope and empowerment. It really speaks to what the deep dive is all about, you know? Taking something complex, breaking it down, and giving you the tools to understand it.
Exactly. Because once you have that understanding, you
Mm.
can start to take control. Make choices that are right for you.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. We've explored the science, the solutions, the emotional impact, even got a glimpse into the future of hair restoration. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on. We've talked a lot about what ProFUE has to offer, but I'm curious to get your take on the broader landscape of hair restoration. What are some things people should consider when exploring their options? Beyond just the technical details of the procedures, I mean.
That's a great question. I think it's important to remember that choosing a hair restoration solution is a very personal thing. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
So, yeah, beyond the technical stuff, you really want to think about your own goals, your lifestyle, your budget, all of that.
Okay, so it's not just about the procedure itself.
Right. Some people might want the absolute latest technology, while others might be more focused on affordability or finding a clinic that feels like a good fit for them, personality-wise.
So it's about finding that right match.
Exactly.
And I imagine doing your research is key, right?
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Get multiple consultations if you need to. Really get a feel for all the different options out there.
Talk to people who've had procedures done, read reviews, gather all the info you can.
Exactly.
It's like with any big health decision, you want to feel informed and empowered. And speaking of empowerment, we've talked a lot about those external solutions, the procedures and all that. But what about internal shifts? How can someone cultivate self-acceptance and confidence even while they're dealing with hair loss?
I think that's such an important part of the whole thing. And it goes beyond just hair, It's about building self-worth that isn't tied to how you look.
Right. It comes from within.
Exactly. One thing that can help is focusing on the things you can control. Your health, your fitness, your style. When you feel good in those areas, it can really boost your confidence overall.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's about shifting the focus from what you might be losing to what you still have and what you can still gain.
I love that. It's a really positive way to look at it.
And remember, true confidence comes from within. It's not about trying to fit some societal ideal of beauty. It's about embracing who you are, flaws and all.
That's such a powerful message.
And when you can do that, well, that's the kind of confidence no amount of hair loss can take away.
That's a beautiful way to put it. We've explored so much today. But before we say goodbye, I have one final thought for you to take with you. We've talked about the science, the solutions, all the emotional stuff, even like what the future might hold for hair restoration. But for me, the biggest takeaway is that you don't have to just like sit back and accept hair loss. There are options out there, and it's all about finding what's right for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the exciting thing is this whole field is constantly changing. Who knows what incredible breakthroughs are coming next?
It's pretty amazing to think about. So as we wrap up this deep dive into male pattern baldness, what's the one thing you really hope listeners take away from our conversation?
I hope they feel empowered, Like they've got some knowledge and some options now. Hair loss can feel really isolating, but you're definitely not alone in this. There's a whole community out there who gets it, and there are resources to help you through it.
That's a great point. And remember, everyone, knowledge is power. The more you understand about this, the better choices you can make.
For sure.
And don't forget about the importance of self-acceptance, finding that confidence that comes from inside.
Yep.
Okay, I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. We've covered so much ground today, and I really hope this deep dive has given you a new way of thinking about male pattern baldness. It's not just about hair, it's about taking control of your health and well-being and owning your story. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, you've got this.